The summer of 1942. The course of the war is hanging by a thread. On the Eastern Front, millions of Soviet soldiers are holding back the fury of Hitler's army. But they are running out of tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel. If the Allies cannot deliver weapons now, the front may crack, and the entire war may begin to move in a different direction. Now imagine this. You are a 20-year-old kid from the American heartland, standing aboard a rusty civilian freighter in the Arctic Ocean. You are not a battleship sailor. You are not on a fast destroyer. You are just a young naval gunner assigned to a merchant ship. Beneath your feet, deep in the holds, are thousands of tons of propellant, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and war cargo. One spark in the wrong place could turn the entire ship into a bomb. You are sailing toward one of the most dangerous destinations of the war, Murmansk. But you are not terrified. Not yet. Because to protect this priceless cargo, the British and Americans have built one of the strongest shields ever placed around an Arctic convoy. Close escort ships are around you. Cruisers are farther out. Heavy forces wait beyond the horizon. It is not an invincible wall, but it is a system of protection men had every right to trust. You look out through the cold glass and believe it. With this kind of protection, we can get through. Then, in the middle of the silence, the radio explodes with a short order. Without a single shell fired by the enemy, that whole system of protection begins to turn away. The cruisers increase speed and leave. The warships are saving themselves. The civilian sailors are left alone with German aircraft, submarines, ice, and the sea. This is the story of Convoy PQ-17. The story of how a command decision left dozens of ships exposed in the Arctic and forced hundreds of men to survive alone. The fatal turn came on July 4, 1942. At exactly 9:36 p.m., over the Arctic, the radio crackled through the polar air. From the warm, quiet rooms of the British Admiralty in London, a short, encrypted signal went out to the covering forces. It contained only a few words. Convoy is to scatter. For a staff officer in England, staring at a chart instead of an ice-covered sea, it was another line in an operational log. For the sailors in the Arctic, those words meant their chances of survival had just collapsed. What did that order mean in the language of war? To scatter meant the convoy would stop being one body. The merchant ships, which had been sailing in a tight formation and protecting one another by their very closeness, now had to break away and head in different directions. And the worst part was the escort. The warships whose anti-aircraft guns and depth charges had been the convoy's only shield against bombers and submarines were turning around and running west at speed. Merchant captains read the signal again and again, refusing to believe what their eyes were seeing. In front of them, the steel wall of protection was disappearing over the horizon. Every ship for itself, alone against the freezing abyss, alone under a polar sun that would not set, alone in a killing zone where German aircraft and U-boats were already waiting. And here, nature played its cruelest trick. The phrase polar day can sound almost beautiful. For PQ-17, it became a trap. In July, above the Arctic Circle, the sun does not truly set. There is no saving darkness. All day and all night, a pale light hangs over the water. In ordinary naval war, night is often the only protection a vulnerable transport can hope for. In darkness, a ship can black out its lights, change course, disappear among waves, and slip away from submarines. But the Arctic summer took that shield away. The huge, slow, heavily loaded freighters were visible to German reconnaissance aircraft around the clock. Like targets laid out on a giant table, the black smoke from their funnels rose into the sky and could be seen for miles. Their wakes shone on gray water like bright arrows pointing toward the prey. There was no true rest, no real darkness, no place to hide. Exhausted men who had barely slept understood it with a kind of sick clarity. The enemy could see every turn, every boat, every trail of smoke. The Arctic had become a perfectly lit shooting range. PQ-17 stopped being a convoy. It became live bait. Winston Churchill would later call the order one of the most melancholy naval episodes of the whole war. But for the men left alone in the freezing water, it was not an episode. It was the end. The tragedy did not begin with that order. It began thousands of miles away from the polar ice, in the roar of assembly lines in Detroit, Liverpool, and New York. It began with cargo. To understand the scale of the disaster, you have to look inside the holds of those ships. There, in the damp dark, stood new Sherman and Grant tanks still smelling of factory paint. Airacobra fighters with their wings removed. Millions of rounds of ammunition. Tons of aviation propellant. Canned food. Medicine. Strategic aluminum. American and British industry was working around the clock, pushing machines and workers to the limit. But producing weapons was only part of the battle. The harder part was getting those weapons to the place where the war was being decided. In the summer of 1942, the Soviet Union was balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The shock of 1941 had been survived. The Germans had been pushed back from Moscow. But by June 1942, the Wehrmacht had recovered and launched a massive strategic offensive in the south. Operation Blue. German armies were driving toward the Volga, Stalingrad, and above all, the oil of the Caucasus. Hitler's logic was simple. Cut the Red Army off from fuel. If German tanks reached the Volga and seized the Caucasus, Soviet machines could stop moving. At the front, shortages of shells and equipment were already brutal. The front was consuming men, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition so quickly that Soviet industry, still rebuilding after evacuation to the Urals, could barely cover the gaps. The USSR needed equipment desperately. Every Allied delivery under Lend-Lease was not measured in dollars or pounds. It was measured in time, in soldiers' lives, in kilometers of ground held. But how do you move millions of tons of metal across oceans that are already battlefields? The Allies had three main supply routes. Each one had a serious flaw. The Pacific route through Vladivostok was relatively safe, but painfully slow. Because the Soviet Union was not at war with Japan, cargo had to be carried on Soviet civilian ships. The Japanese stopped and inspected ships constantly, blocking obvious military cargo. And whatever got through still had to cross all of Siberia on the overloaded Trans-Siberian Railway. The cargo took months to reach the front. The Persian corridor through Iran was safer in some ways, but enormous. Ships had to go around Africa, enter the Persian Gulf, unload in Iran, then move trucks, aircraft, and supplies across mountains and deserts. A delivery could take 3 or 4 months. The Arctic route was different, the shortest, the fastest, and the deadliest. From Iceland, past German-occupied Norway, straight to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. In 10 to 12 days, cargo could reach the Soviet north. It was like an injection of adrenaline into the arteries of a fighting army. On maps, in Washington and London, the line looked simple, a clean arc through the northern seas. In reality, it was a road through frozen hell, a route where every day depended on weather, ice, and the German bases in Norway. But before that hell opened on the ocean, it boiled in government offices. Behind PQ-17 was a hard, cynical, psychological struggle between the leaders of 3 great powers: Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt. And that struggle helped decide the fate of ordinary sailors. The previous convoy, PQ-16, had fought its way to Murmansk in May. but 7 loaded transports were lost. The British Admiralty was horrified. The British understood exactly what it meant to send another convoy during the height of the polar summer, when the sun did not set. It looked close to suicide. Whitehall wanted to delay the convoy until the darkness of autumn, but pressing the brakes was impossible. From Moscow came messages full of hard pressure. Joseph Stalin, whose front was cracking under the German offensive, accused the British of lacking resolve. In the private correspondence between the leaders, the Soviet position was blunt. If supplies were being delayed because of fear of German aircraft, that was unacceptable. Ships were meant to fight, not hide in harbor. Churchill was furious. The Royal Navy was already taking heavy losses around the world, defending Britain and fighting in the Mediterranean. Then the White House joined the pressure. Franklin Roosevelt took the hard line of a strategist. If Stalin was not supported now, the Soviet front might collapse. If Hitler reached the Caucasus oil fields, the war could become almost impossible to win. Washington pushed with all its weight. The convoy had to sail. The risk was justified. The British command was trapped. Admirals had to prepare an operation many of them did not believe could succeed. Politicians argued about honor, obligations, and grand strategy. But they argued in dry, warm rooms. The men who would pay for those decisions were ordinary working sailors from Nebraska, Liverpool, Glasgow, London, New York, and other places that had never seen the Barents Sea. Men already sailing toward a trap prepared by nature itself. In the Arctic, the sea does not simply storm. It can kill before the ship ever receives a hole in her hull. The first invisible enemy is the wind. It throws salt spray over the decks, and at Arctic temperatures that spray freezes instantly on cold metal. A heavy crust of ice grows on guns, rails, superstructures, derricks, and decks. The ship's balance begins to change. If the crew doesn't chop that ice away for hours with axes and crowbars, taking turns in the freezing wind, the ship becomes top-heavy. She loses stability, and eventually she can roll over like an overloaded shell. Gun crews warmed breeches and mechanisms with torches and rags because lubricants froze and metal seized against metal. The water was so cold that a man overboard had almost no chance. A life jacket became almost meaningless. You had minutes. The heart could fail from cold shock before a boat could even be lowered. The ice slush beside the hull killed faster than many men could understand what had happened. In winter, the route had at least one mask, polar night. But PQ-17 sailed at the height of summer. The constant polar day now showed its full power. There would be no darkness to rely on. For merchant ships, that endless light was a curse. You could not disappear in twilight. You could not change course under cover of night. You could not hide a damaged ship. The thick black coal smoke from freighter funnels stretched into the sky and stayed visible over the horizon. The wake on smooth gray water flashed under the low sun like a mirror road. Once, a single German Focke-Wulf reconnaissance aircraft found the convoy. It could hang above the masts for hours, high above the reach of the merchant ship's weaker guns. It could circle and report by radio, guiding in torpedo bombers and submarines. The Arctic became the illuminated range where the targets could hardly hide. The first Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union had gone through more smoothly because the Germans underestimated the route. At first, Berlin treated the northern supply line as a secondary Allied experiment, while the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine focused on supporting the land war. By the spring of 1942, that had changed. Hitler had become obsessed with defending the northern flank, fearing an Allied landing in Norway, and ordered the Arctic approaches turned into a fortress. The German command woke up to the danger. Hundreds of aircraft moved to Norway. U-boats filled the fjords. The great surface ships of the Kriegsmarine were placed on alert. PQ-17 had already fought its way to Murmansk at heavy cost. 7 loaded ships were gone. The message was clear. There would be no easy runs now. But Stalin demanded supplies. The Soviet front was suffocating under the offensive in the south. Washington and London could not refuse. On June 27, 1942, PQ-17 sailed from Hvalfjord in Iceland, a harbor lost among gray rock and cold water. It was a giant caravan. 35 cargo ships, heavy in the water under the weight of war. 2 soon suffered serious ice damage and had to turn back. But the remaining 33 transports pressed east, formed into orderly columns. In their holds and on their decks lashed down with steel cables was cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Almost 300 aircraft, more than 400 tanks, 3,500 trucks, tens of thousands of tons of propellant, shells, aviation fuel, food, medicine, and other supplies. Enough metal to equip a major fighting force. In effect, an armored transfusion was moving east toward the Soviet front. On paper, this was not a defenseless herd. It had the strongest escort yet assigned to an Arctic convoy. The Admiralty built a layered protection system. Close escort was provided by 6 destroyers, corvettes, and minesweepers under the experienced commander Jack Broom. These smaller warships circled the merchant ships, ready to hunt submarines, drop depth charges, and lay smokescreens. Farther out sailed the cruiser covering force, 4 heavy cruisers. And beyond them, at a distance, stood heavier forces of the home fleet, including the British carrier Victorious and the new American battleship USS Washington. Their job was simple. If German surface raiders came out, they would intercept them. PQ-17 was not an abandoned crowd of civilian ships. Experienced captains stood on the bridges. Gun crews waited by their weapons. Radio operators kept their headphones on for days. The men knew they were sailing into hell, but they believed in the hard tactical logic of the convoy. As long as we stay together, we have a chance. 1 ship alone in the ocean is weak. 30 ships in a tight formation, surrounded by crossing anti-aircraft fire and destroyers with depth charges, become a floating fortress. That system worked. The men were ready to fight, ready to take hits, ready to put out fires and keep moving. They were not ready for their own high command to strip away that protection and leave them to survive alone. Among the hundreds of men aboard PQ-17 was Donald Ross Nagatz, an ordinary young man from Nebraska. To understand the strange cruelty of his fate, you have to understand Nebraska. Deep inland America, endless cornfields and pasture, a place where the largest body of water a boy might know could be a local river or pond. Donald grew up far from ports. He had never seen the great oceans of war. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, his world changed. Like thousands of young men his age, Nagatz volunteered for the Navy. In his imagination, service might have meant a great battleship or a fast destroyer. Instead, the Navy assigned him to the Naval Armed Guard. It was a strange, dangerous, and often bitter service. In the regular Navy, some called these men the stepchildren. They wore the uniform, they had taken the oath, but they served aboard civilian merchant ships. A handful of Navy men were sent onto rusty cargo vessels to operate hastily installed anti-aircraft guns or an old stern gun. There was no armor. Their ships could not maneuver like destroyers. They could not dive. They could not outrun aircraft. They were huge, slow, vulnerable boxes filled with war cargo. And in Nagatz's case, it was not only grain or clothing. He was assigned to SS Pan-Atlantic. In June 1942, as the boy from Nebraska stood watch, he did not know that the name of his ship would become one of the most terrible stories of PQ-17. In Pan-Atlantic's holds were stacks of cordite, explosives, and tanks of high-octane aviation fuel. Nagatz and his shipmates were sailing on top of a giant bomb. One shell fragment, one spark in the wrong hold, and the ship could be blown apart in seconds. In the first days, everything looked deceptively secure. The ships moved in a clean formation. The escort watched the perimeter. Radar scanned the horizon. But the Arctic was already pressing on Nagatz's mind. The polar day turned the ocean into a huge stage flooded with pale, cold light. There was no southern darkness to hide the convoy, even for a few hours. They were constantly visible in the middle of that endless gray mirror. Donald stood for hours at his Oerlikon gun, staring into the empty sky through frost-stiff binoculars. His fingers stuck to cold metal. His eyes watered from wind and light. The sailors felt as if every movement was being watched. And it was not paranoia. Somewhere in the black water, and somewhere beyond the low polar clouds, the enemy was waiting. On July 1st, German air reconnaissance finally found the convoy. From that second, PQ-17 was no longer moving through the sea on its own terms. It was being tracked. German navigators at bases in Norway began plotting interception courses. Kriegsmarine submarines began tightening the ring. Luftwaffe pilots warmed their engines. The trap had closed, and Donald Nagatz was inside it. On July 2nd came the first cautious Luftwaffe attacks. Probing attacks. Single bombers tested the convoy's anti-aircraft fire, dropped bombs through gaps in the cloud, and turned away. On July 3rd, the attacks became bolder. The pressure on the bridges rose by the hour. Deadly Junkers bombers came in groups now. Air raid alarms howled again and again. Decks became littered with spent shell cases. By July 4th, the convoy was moving inside a suffocating atmosphere of inevitable disaster. Men had gone without proper sleep for days. Their eyes were inflamed from searching the blinding sky where death could appear at any moment. While tension rose aboard Allied ships, the German war machine on the other side of the Barents Sea was working with cold precision. The Germans were no longer guessing. They knew where the convoy was. Now Berlin prepared a coordinated hunt for PQ-17 under the codename Unternehmen Russelsprung. Operation Knight's Move. The goal was not merely to sink a few transports. It was to destroy the Arctic route as a serious supply line. At the Arctic Luftwaffe bases of Banak and Kirkenes, lost among bare Finnish and Norwegian rock, the heavy rumble of aircraft engines hardly stopped. Pilots of Luftflotte 5, experienced naval airmen, lived close to their machines under the endless sun. Mechanics, in oil-stained overalls, hung heavy bombs beneath Junkers Ju-88 dive bombers, and long steel aerial torpedoes beneath Heinkel HE-111s. In navigation huts, among cigarette smoke and empty mugs of strong coffee, operational maps were updated hour by hour with the course of PQ-17. The German air crews waited for the convoy to come out of mist and cloud into the clear light of the polar sun. It was not just war, it was a planned hunt. At the same time, the convoy was being pressed from the depths. Along the transport route, a group of Kriegsmarine U-boats took up positions. The wolf pack was called Ice Wolf. Ice Wolf. German submariners held stations for weeks in the bitter cold of the Barents Sea. Inside the boats, the air smelled of damp metal, diesel, and sweat. Men on the bridges froze under sea spray. Commanders spent hour after hour at periscopes and binoculars. Sound operators listened for the rhythmic beat of civilian propellers. Officers waited in fog for the perfect firing moment. They knew there were too few escort destroyers to protect everyone. But the most terrifying danger for the Allies was not a torpedo bomber. It was a psychological shadow. Tirpitz, the German super battleship, sister ship of Bismarck, a floating fortress of more than 45,000 tons, with heavy armor and enormous guns. Her 8 380mm main guns could destroy any merchant ship from more than 30 kilometers away, long before the civilian sailors could even see her masts on the horizon. For the Royal Navy, the name Bismarck was still an open wound. Only a year earlier, Bismarck had destroyed HMS Hood, the pride of the fleet, taking more than 1,500 lives. Now her sister ship, Tirpitz, sat in the Norwegian fjords, combat-ready, hidden among rock and camouflage nets, warming her huge turbines. That was the core of the German trap. Tirpitz did not need to sail into the open sea and fire a single salvo to threaten the convoy. She only had to exist. The material possibility of her sortie was enough to paralyze calculations in the British Admiralty. If that steel monster intercepted the slow, defenseless freighters, she could destroy them quickly. If she caught the Allied cruisers, the Royal Navy could lose irreplaceable ships in one day. The logic in London was hard and pragmatic. Do not risk the elite units of the fleet for foreign trucks, tanks, and canned meat. In that logic, the merchant ships moved to second place. July 4th, 1942. While American and British sailors aboard the freighters tried to mark Independence Day under scattered Luftwaffe attacks, a tense staff drama was unfolding in the Admiralty. In the operations rooms in London, alarming and incomplete intercepts began arriving one after another. The German heavy squadron, possibly led by Tirpitz, had allegedly left its anchorage in the fjords and might be heading to intercept the convoy. Inside the quiet rooms, through thick cigarette smoke, officers stared at charts. They did not see the burning cold water of the Barents Sea. They did not hear the sirens or the guns. They thought in abstract risks, tonnage, arrows, possibilities. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, was driven by fear. Fear of losing cruisers, fear of another Hood, fear of a naval disaster that would be impossible to explain. Then, the irreversible mechanism began. 3 signals, sent within minutes, broke the convoy's protection system. At 9:11 p.m., the cruiser covering force was ordered to withdraw westward at maximum speed. The warships turned away from the transports. On the merchant bridges, a stunned murmur began. Civilian sailors watched in disbelief as British cruisers, bristling with heavy guns, poured black smoke from their funnels and accelerated away from the men they had been sent to protect. At 9:23 p.m., another message came from London. Because of the threat of surface attack, the convoy was to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. The word disperse still left captains some faint hope of control, some possibility of a common course. But in London, it seemed Tirpitz was already raising a steel fist over the operation. At 9:36 p.m., the fatal phrase went out, ordered by Dudley Pound himself. Convoy is to scatter. Everything was over. The British Naval Command had admitted its own helplessness and left the merchant ships to be hunted. Imagine that moment from the bridge of a civilian freighter. The captain reads those words again. Then again. He rubs his eyes. He cannot believe they are printed on an official signal. The formation, the law of mutual defense, the thing that had given men at least some belief in safety, is falling apart in front of them. Ships begin to turn away from each other in fear and confusion. A minute earlier, friendly silhouettes had surrounded them. Now, those silhouettes are fading into cold polar haze. Smoke trails spread across the horizon like a fan. The gray, empty sea widens between the ships, swallowing the last traces of hope. The order has destroyed the order. The strategists in London believed dispersal would make the German task harder. Aircraft and submarines, they thought, would have to chase each ship separately. In practice, it was a terrible failure of staff logic. They had stripped the men of their only effective weapon, collective defense. There was no longer a single anti-aircraft umbrella to meet the Luftwaffe with a wall of crossing fire. No destroyers close by with depth charges to drive U-boats away from unprotected hulls. Each captain was alone with his fate. Some turned north toward the pack ice, trying to hide among ice fields and fog. Some raced for the Soviet coast, forcing old engines to their limits and praying for a storm. For the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine U-boats, it was a rare gift. Instead of a fierce formation bristling with guns, they had dozens of isolated targets, slow, vulnerable, and visible in the endless light. They no longer had to break through the combined fire of warships. PQ-17 stopped being a convoy. It became a doomed kill list. And on July 5th, the Germans began crossing off the names one by one. The Arctic radio channels erupted with desperate distress calls, overlapping in the receivers. "We are being bombed, on fire, losing speed, abandoning ship, torpedo attack. Submarines around us, need assistance." But there was almost no one left to save them. The warships were steaming west. The admirals in London could tell themselves they had saved major fleet units. For that decision, hundreds of ordinary sailors were paying in the freezing water of the Barents Sea. July 5, 1942, would enter the history of the Arctic convoys under a dark name, Bloody Sunday. From that day on, the radio no longer carried orderly reports, clear tactical commands, or coordinated maneuvers. The formation was gone. Chaos began. Each ship tried to survive alone in the middle of a vast frozen emptiness. The German war machine turned the scattered ships into an assembly line of attacks. Groups of Junkers Ju-88 dive bombers came in waves, relieving one another on a schedule, giving exhausted sailors no time to breathe or reload. Heinkel H-111 torpedo bombers came in low over the water, searching for the right angle to launch their steel torpedoes. And under the water, the most brutal sign of the day appeared. Kriegsmarine submarines, sensing that escort destroyers were no longer close enough to stop them, did not even have to hide. They surfaced in the open sea and calmly fired on overloaded transports with deck guns, saving expensive torpedoes. A lone civilian freighter against coordinated attack from air, surface, and below is not a battle. It is a slaughter. On the decks of sinking ships, civilian sailors and naval armed guard crews fought to the end. They gripped triggers until the barrels of Oerlikons and machine guns burned hot. Spent shell cases rang across frozen metal. Powder smoke burned their eyes. The great hulls shuddered under near misses from heavy bombs. There was no shield. If a German bomb hit a hold packed with aviation fuel, propellant, or ammunition, the ship did not simply sink. It vanished in a giant burst of fire within seconds, leaving the crew almost no chance at all. But even if a crew survived the first blast, even if they reacted fast enough to get boats into the water, that did not guarantee life. In the Arctic, a life raft or wooden boat is only a delay before hypothermia. Around the soaked men stretched hundreds of miles of freezing waves, storm wind, and empty sea. The chance that anyone would see them and pick them up was close to nothing. On July 5th alone, German forces sent 12 ships to the bottom, 12 huge priceless transports in 24 hours, a floating cemetery. But behind that number were hundreds of private human disasters. One of the hardest episodes of the day happened to the American ship SS Carleton. After a German torpedo ripped open her side, the ship began going down fast. Survivors, stunned by the blast, soaked through, and already freezing in the polar wind, managed to jump into lifeboats. They were still trying to understand that they had just lost their ship when the water in front of them began to boil. Out of the Black Ocean came the steel hull of a German U-boat. The Germans came almost alongside the helpless boat. On the submarine's bridge stood a German officer in a dry, clean uniform, shockingly different from the half-frozen, oil-stained Americans in the boat. He took a loudhailer and through the wind calmly interrogated Carleton's shivering captain, demanding the name of the ship and the nature of her cargo. At that moment, the men in the lifeboat understood absolute helplessness. You are sitting in a sliver of wood in the Arctic. You have no weapon. Your fingers are stiff with cold. And above you stands an enemy who in that second can decide whether to open fire and end your life now, or leave you to freeze in the ocean. That was war without romance. Cold, cynical, merciless. While some ships thrashed through the ocean and died under attack, others survived through instinct, sharpened by cold calculation. The strangest survival story of PQ-17 belongs to the small British anti-submarine trawler HMS Ayrshire and 3 merchant ships following her, Troubadour, Ironclad, and Silver Sword. Their commander, Royal Navy Lieutenant Leo Gradwell, was not a traditional naval aristocrat. In civilian life, he had been a London barrister, a lawyer, and maybe that helped him make a decision no manual would have suggested. Gradwell did not think like a man trapped inside rigid instructions. He thought like a man looking for a loophole in a hopeless contract. Looking at the Admiralty signal, he understood at once. Trying to break east through open water was a death route. So he did something that looked tactically insane. He turned his ships due north, straight into the Arctic pack ice. It was a huge risk. Civilian freighters with thin steel hulls were not icebreakers. Heavy ice fields could crush them within hours, leaving crews to freeze on the floes. They pushed as deep into the ice as courage allowed. Then he ordered engines stopped and boilers damped down. No more smoke, no more propeller noise. The little group became still. Then came the strange logic of war. Every barrel of white paint was brought up from the holds. Men tied themselves with ropes, went out onto the decks and over the sides, and in the tearing wind began painting hulls, masts, and superstructures white by hand. When the paint ran out, they used anything pale they could find: sheets, pillowcases, mattress covers, tablecloths, medical cloth. They stretched the fabric across decks and tied it hard to railings, trying to break up the shapes of the ships. The most striking scene happened aboard Troubadour. American Sherman tanks carried as cargo were brought out on the upper deck. The crew and armed guard men were not going to surrender without a fight. They tore canvas covers from the tanks, climbed into the freezing armor, uncovered the guns, and turned the turrets toward the possible approach of the enemy. In the middle of Arctic ice, on the deck of a frozen merchant ship, tanks stood ready to fire at submarines or destroyers. The group had become an improvised ice fort. From above, to German Focke-Wulf reconnaissance aircraft, the frozen ships looked like ordinary snow-covered ridges. And it worked. Sailors with paintbrushes in frozen hands, led by a London lawyer, fooled the Luftwaffe and survived where the regular fleet had chosen to pull back. But most lonely ships did not get that kind of miracle. There was not enough white paint for everyone, and polar fog is treacherous. 1 minute, it hides you behind a wall. 5 minutes later, it clears and leaves you alone with the enemy. On July 6, 1942, it was the turn of the American ship SS Pan-Atlantic. On her after superstructure, at an anti-aircraft gun, stood 20-year-old Donald Nagatz. At 6:10 p.m., the sound of aircraft engines came over the sea. From the low clouds dropped a lone Junkers Ju-88 dive bomber. The German pilot had found an isolated freighter and immediately entered a dive, aiming for the center of the deck. Nagetz pressed the trigger of his Oerlikon. The gun shook in his hands, throwing a stream of fire toward the falling aircraft. Donald saw tracers hit the wings and fuselage. Pieces flew from the German machine, but the pilot held his course long enough to release. 2 heavy bombs fell from the aircraft. An instant later, they punched through the thin plating of the freighter's deck with a terrible metallic crash. They exploded deep below in the main hold, where boxes of cordite lay stacked in neat rows. Cordite, powerful propellant, urgently needed by Soviet artillery. The blast was enormous. The forward part of the great ship was torn open. A column of fire and red-hot metal rose hundreds of feet into the air. Men who saw it from nearby rafts said Pan-Atlantic seemed to break in two like a branch. The freighter sank in exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes is almost nothing. In panic and smoke, it is not enough time to get from a cabin to the upper deck. There was no organized evacuation, no proper lowering of lifeboats, only the deafening blow, the dead list of the ship, a wall of freezing water rushing through the breaks, and the terrible realization that the steel world beneath your feet no longer physically exists. The ocean had taken it. The blast hurled Donald Nagetz from the superstructure and threw him far overboard. The dry phrase "he landed in the water" cannot describe what the boy from Nebraska felt. Arctic water in July is not simply cold. It is a physical strike against the whole body. Cold shock steals the breath. The lungs seize before a man can even scream. Muscles stiffen and lose power within seconds. Heavy winter clothing, soaked through, gains weight and drags the body toward the depths. The panicked mind still orders the body to swim, but the numb body begins to disobey. Nagetz was almost impossibly lucky. As he began to lose consciousness, the sea pushed him toward a piece of wooden wreckage. With sharp pain in his freezing hands, he managed to hook himself onto it and climb onto a small wooden raft. When he came back to himself, coughed out bitter seawater, and lifted his head, there was almost nothing around him. A huge smoking patch of oil spread across the water, smelling of fuel and fire. His ship was gone. His friends were gone. His old life had disappeared in 3 minutes. And on the raft with him lay only the stiff, pale body of his dead friend from the gun crew. The endless polar day still poured cold light over the scene. Donald was alone with the Arctic Ocean. No food, no heat, no idea whether there would be a tomorrow. To survive on that tiny wooden patch in the middle of the sea, Donald Nagetz had to do something survivors often cannot speak about later. Freezing water washed constantly over the raft. Under the weight of 2 bodies, it sank lower and lower, threatening to roll over with the next heavy wave. Nagetz made the terrible choice. Fighting numbness, he pushed the frozen body of his dead shipmate into the water. The raft could not carry them both. The ocean took the dead sailor immediately. The freed raft rose slightly above the waves, giving the living man his only chance. In a normal, civilized life, no human being should have to make that decision. But the Arctic had erased normal laws in minutes. Nagetz spent roughly 24 hours alone on that raft. 24 hours under a dead white sun that circled overhead and would not let him sink into darkness. Around him, there was nothing but oil smoke, cold, spray, and salt drying into a crust on his face. The mind of a young man from Nebraska was beginning to break when an overloaded lifeboat from another sunken ship finally saw the raft. But that rescue was not the end of the nightmare. The boat that took him aboard was made of thin planks. It leaked. It was packed with wounded men. In that open wooden shell in the middle of a storming sea, they spent several more long days. Men raved, lost strength, and died of cold beside their friends. When the British corvette HMS Lotus finally found the battered boat and picked up the survivors, Nagetz was in critical condition, close to death. His hands and feet had been so damaged by frost and wet that medics had to cut away his shoes and socks to begin treatment. That Donald survived at all and kept his limbs was a miracle. But the experience stayed with him for the rest of his life. Of Pan-Atlantic's civilian crew, half died that day. Almost the entire Naval Armed Guard detachment was lost. The young men who had joked in their quarters a week earlier now lay at the bottom of the barren sea. And the worst part is this: Donald Nagetz's painful odyssey was the story of only one ship. At the same time, across the vast Arctic space from Bear Island toward Novaya Zemlya, dozens of similar human disasters were unfolding. The convoy was being destroyed in pieces. When modern historians look at the overall statistics of PQ-17, the true scale can disappear inside tables and reports. The books say 24 transports lost, but after the fatal order to scatter, the Germans were not destroying an abstract convoy. They were burning, torpedoing, and drowning individual worlds, ship by ship. Each freighter, old tramp steamer, or new Liberty ship was a small community of 40 or 50 men. They had jokes, plans for the evening, fears, hopes. After July 4th, the drama began again inside each of those little worlds. For some, the end became a desperate race with death. Somewhere, a captain ordered every last turn squeezed from worn-out engines, trying to drive a heavily loaded ship into a strip of polar fog, knowing that if the sun cleared for even 1 minute, they were finished. Somewhere deep below, in the blackness of an engine room, a damage control team coughed in oil smoke, knee-deep in freezing water, trying to patch a hole by feel. Steel rivets snapped around them. Scalding steam hissed. The deck leaned more sharply with every minute. The ship's structure groaned under stress, but men refused to leave their stations as long as generators still fed the pumps. Somewhere in a radio room, cut off from the rest of the world, a young operator kept tapping out his ship's coordinates until the final seconds. Even as water reached the doorway, the Morse key clicked. He knew almost certainly that no one would hear. The British destroyers were far to the west. The Soviet bases were too distant to send help in time. But he kept sending into the void because it was his last duty to the men aboard. And somewhere else, there was no time for duty at all. Men without life jackets jumped from the height of a 3-story building into a freezing mixture of oil and broken ice, seconds before their ship rolled over with a deep metallic groan and pulled everyone still aboard into the depths. The hunt continued without pause from July 5th to July 10th, 5 days that felt to the sailors like one endless watch under a sun that refused to set. Aircraft of Luftwaffe 5 flew hundreds of sorties. Pilots returned to their bases in Norway, refueled, loaded new bombs, and went back to the scattered convoy again and again. Kriegsmarine U-boats followed damaged ships like hunters trailing wounded prey. The Arctic left nothing unfinished. If a ship was damaged and lost speed, it was doomed. Sooner or later, a German shell, a torpedo, or the ice itself would find it. The story of the Dutch freighter SS Paulus Potter became one of the bleakest symbols of the disaster. The large transport came under a heavy attack by German dive bombers. Bombs exploded dangerously close to her hull. She lost power, began listing badly, and her captain believed she was about to capsize and sink. He ordered the ship abandoned. The exhausted crew lowered boats and moved away. But Paulus Potter refused to die at once. Empty, crippled, without a single man aboard, she drifted alone for days in the open ocean. A great steel box moving with current and wind through fog and ice, like a ghost ship. Doors swung on abandoned cabins. Half-finished cups of coffee remained on tables. In the holds, thousands of tons of tanks and shells for the Red Army still waited in darkness. Days later, the frozen ghost was found by the German submarine U-255 under Reinhard Recke. At first, the submariners could hardly believe what they were seeing through the periscope. A huge ship moving without any sign of life. Finally, the submarine surfaced, and a German boarding party climbed aboard. They walked through the empty corridors, took secret documents and navigation charts from the captain's safe, removed the flag as a trophy, and returned to their submarine. Then U-255 withdrew to a safe distance and finished the dead, defenseless ship with a torpedo. The whole story of PQ-17 is reflected in that ship, a remnant of disaster, abandoned by its own command, left behind by everyone, and still, in that frozen emptiness, eventually found by the enemy, a death sentence no one could outrun. For steel ships, the end often came in minutes. For survivors thrown into the indifferent ocean, the nightmare could last for weeks. The only landmark, the only solid ground for hundreds of miles, was Novaya Zemlya, the barren Arctic archipelago of gray cliffs, ice, and silent fjords. Toward that coast went overcrowded lifeboats, rafts, and the few damaged transports that still somehow floated. Men landed on a shore that was never meant for human life. They had no dry, warm clothing, almost no medicine. Food was running out. Around them stretched permafrost, cutting wind, and the grinding ice of the surf. Officers and sailors who had been sleeping in warm bunks and drinking hot coffee only days earlier were now fighting for each hour of existence. From wreckage, storm-thrown boxes, driftwood, and soaked canvas, they built primitive camps. The shelters looked less like 20th century naval camps than something from the edge of prehistory. Wounds bandaged with whatever could be found became inflamed in the cold. Clothes soaked with seawater dried into stiff, salty armor, rubbing skin raw and making movement painful. But physical pain was only half the danger. The real threat to sanity was the polar day, the same endless light that had helped German pilots attack the convoy now continued its silent work on land. The merciless sun moved around the horizon day and night, denying exhausted men the darkness of real sleep. In that constant light, time began to break. Days merged into one endless gray mass. The mind began to fail. In the camps, panic attacks broke out. Men heard ships that were not there, voices of people back home, engines approaching through fog. The body, exhausted by hunger, cold, and stress, began surrendering too. Scurvy appeared. Gums bled. Men grew weaker. Frostbitten fingers untreated, swelled, inflamed, and lost feeling. Then came another fear. The smell of fuel oil, smoke, and scarce food drew the rulers of that coast. Huge, hungry animals, with no fear of men, came close to the canvas shelters. The sailors, sometimes with little more than signal pistols, knives, and iron bars, had to organize constant watches. They were fighting off bears in isolation at the end of the earth. They did not know how many of their comrades had survived. They did not know if anyone was looking for them. Rescue came from where the exhausted British and Americans had almost stopped expecting it. Soviet command in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, once the scale of the disaster became clear from survivors and radio messages, threw whatever northern forces it could into the search. Small Soviet civilian vessels, old fishing trawlers, tugs, slow MBR-2 flying boats. They began searching the cut-up coast of Novaya Zemlya, fjord by fjord. Soviet polar pilots did difficult, dangerous work. They set fragile aircraft down on rough, freezing water. They squeezed into narrow, rocky inlets and fog banks, scanning gray cliffs for the tiny shapes of human beings. Captains of Soviet trawlers, knowing that a German submarine could be waiting at any moment, brought their vessels close to shallow reefs and rocks to take aboard half-dead, frostbitten, exhausted Allied sailors. That quiet, nearly invisible rescue effort pulled hundreds of men back from death. But for the few ships still trying to crawl alone toward Murmansk across open water, the final pages of the drama were still being written in fear. And what about Tirpitz, the steel leviathan whose shadow had made British admirals break the laws of convoy brotherhood and condemn their own caravan? Here lies the bitterest tactical irony of the story. Tirpitz never intercepted PQ-17. The German battleship did not fire a single shell at the scattered merchant ships. She never even came close enough to see them. The nightmare that froze the will of First Sea Lord Dudley Pound, the image of the German giant's huge guns smashing merchant ships at close range, remained a nightmare on paper. The Germans had played a nearly perfect Grandmaster's game without moving their most powerful piece into battle. In naval strategy, this is called a fleet in being. Tirpitz did not have to sink the ships personally. She only had to exist. To smoke in a Norwegian fjord, to warm her enormous turbines. She destroyed the convoy with her name. When the battleship did briefly leave anchorage on July 5th, German command soon learned that the Luftwaffe and U-boats had already torn the defenseless convoy apart. The monster was ordered back. Hitler was terrified of losing his flagship, and no one wanted to risk her merely to finish isolated freighters. PQ-17 was not destroyed by shells from the German super battleship. It was destroyed by bombs and total suffocating loneliness. Loneliness created by a panic order from its own side. It is easy, decades later, sitting in a warm chair with declassified archives from both sides, to say this was a cowardly, catastrophic mistake. But history demands a harsher kind of fairness. The men in London made decisions inside an information vacuum, false intelligence, and suffocating pressure. On their charts, Tirpitz was already moving toward the convoy. They did not know where the battleship was exactly. They feared losing the cruisers in a single day. For Britain, losing those warships could have meant disaster in the wider Battle of the Atlantic and a deeper isolation of the island. War rarely gives a commander a clean choice between good and bad. More often, there are only two options on the table: frightening and unknown. But the tragedy of high command is always the same. The price for that decision, for panic on signal forms and abstract risks on maps, is paid by specific living men at the front. The civilian sailors of PQ-17, freezing on rafts and dying in explosions, paid for that staff decision in full. With blood left forever in the Arctic abyss. Of the 33 merchant ships that continued east after the ice damage, only 11 reached the safety of Soviet ports. 22 heavily loaded ships remained forever on the bottom of the Arctic. Along with them went a vast cargo of Lend-Lease supplies desperately needed on the Eastern Front. To make those losses visible, 3,350 vehicles, thousands of new frontline trucks that would never carry shells, wounded men, or bread, 430 tanks, enough armor for several tank corps. Instead of forming for battle near Stalingrad or Rzhev, that steel rusted in salt water. 210 aircraft, whole squadrons of fighters and bombers that would never rise over the burning Soviet rear and never protect infantry from the Luftwaffe. About 100,000 tons of ammunition, strategic raw materials, medicine, and food. In the scale of total war, these were delayed operations, missing supplies, and lost chances. An exhausted country fighting with everything it had did not receive that arsenal at the critical moment of the summer of 1942. But Detroit and New York could build more tanks. Industry could construct more Liberty ships. The one thing war can never replace is human life. Along with armor and ammunition, 153 merchant seamen died in the Barents Sea. Beside the enormous land battles of 1942, where divisions could be destroyed in a single day, that number looked small to analysts. There is nothing small about it. Each of those 153 men did not die as an abstract dot on a map in a London bunker. Each died alone, choking in oil, burning in real fire, freezing in real water. As the steel keels of their ships disappeared into the dark, the disaster of PQ-17 remains a monument to human courage and a severe reminder of the price frontline men pay for the fears and mistakes of distant rooms. After the slaughter, Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union were temporarily suspended. The next convoy, PQ-18, would sail only in the autumn of 1942, and its protection would be rebuilt from the ground up. This time, an escort carrier sailed with it. This time, commanders of warships were under strict orders not to abandon the merchant ships under any circumstances. The Admiralty had learned the lesson, but the price of that lesson had been paid by other men. The wound of PQ-17 remained. It became an example of how tactical logic can break under paralyzing fear. Sometimes the enemy does not need to strike you physically in order to win. It is enough to make you believe the strike is inevitable. Then you destroy your own plan with your own hands. Tirpitz remained only a motionless steel shadow in a Norwegian fjord. But that shadow was enough to break a convoy. That is the central horror of the story. The merchant sailors were trapped between two fears. The fear of the Admiralty, far away in London, losing its elite cruisers, and their own fear of being left alone with the ocean. The staff chose to save the fleet. The sailors received the order to die one by one. After the war, books would be written, trials, investigations, and accusations would follow. Old admirals would defend themselves with incomplete intelligence. Historians would argue for decades over whether the convoy might have survived if it had stayed together as a fortress. But for Donald Nagatz, who would remember the freezing water, oil, and frost-bitten hands for the rest of his life, and for the men whose bodies remained locked in frozen holds on the floor of the Barents Sea, those arguments came too late. Their reality in July 1942 was simple. At the worst moment of their lives, they were alone. Alone with the freezing abyss. For a long time, the Arctic convoys remained in the shadow of the great land battles of the Second World War. PQ-17 rarely appears on the first page when people speak of the turning points of 1942. Stalingrad, Sevastopol, El Alamein. Those vast names buried the drama that unfolded across the frozen northern seas. But the story of PQ-17 is one of the bitter lessons of that war. It proved that at sea, as in life, victory is not only mathematics, gun caliber, or armor thickness. A convoy is strong only as long as its ships hold together. When trust at the front is replaced by staff calculation far in the rear, and collective defense is replaced by fear for valuable warships, disaster becomes almost inevitable. Today, the Barents Sea can look calm. On its bottom, under deep layers of icy water, lie the wrecks of the lost ships. The wooden rafts have rotted away. The tanks have rusted. The names of many dead sailors have faded from public memory. But that silence is deceptive. It still carries the echo of the 3 fatal words sent over the air in July 1942. Words that fix the nightmare of PQ-17 forever. The most dangerous trap in war is not always the enemy on the horizon. Sometimes it is the order to abandon your own.